Hello and welcome to Timeless with Julie Hartman Live. It is Tuesday, June 11th, 2024. I'm Julie Hartman, and it is great, as always, to be with you. Now, usually right now, I would shout out the call-in number, which is 844-861-5537, 844-861-5537. I'm just at this point bragging that I've memorized the call-in number, but today I'm going to encourage you to use the live chat, which I have a direct line to right here. You know the rule. Just keep it classy. That's what we do on Timeless with Julie Hartman. But the reason why I'm encouraging you to use the live chat today instead of the call-in number is because we have a very special episode, and that is our long-awaited Thinker of the Month series. We, in the spirit of full honesty, did miss about a month or two. Forgive us. Travel schedules, filming schedules, you know the drill. Life can get really busy. But for those of you who don't know the Thinker of the Month series, I really encourage you to check it out. It's one of the favorite things that I do here on this show. I'm so delighted to welcome Spencer Klavan back to the show, who is my co-conspirator or co-host, if you will, of this Thinker of the Month series that we do. And we have done quite a number of episodes. We've discussed Friedrich Nietzsche, who I like to say is both brilliant and devious. You'll find out why when you check out that episode, why I have that opinion. We've also talked about Karl Marx, speaking of devious, on our Thinker of the Month series. We've done Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Dostoevsky, Charlotte Bronte, one of my favorite authors, Jesus Christ, who's definitely the thinker of every single month, but we profiled him in the month of December. To commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Gulag Archipelago, we talked about Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And let's see, I have my notes here. We've also done how various cultures have understood God, featuring the Shiva Linga that Spencer Klavan saw at the Great Angkor Wat Temple in Cambodia. Most recently, we did Aristotle, talked for about an hour about what we ought to know about Aristotelian prose. And today, can I get a drum roll, please? We are talking about what thinker, what event, Donald Trump. Let's get the martyr. That's right. That's the mugshot that everybody knows about. We know that about 2 weeks ago, as I like to say, our martyr was martyred when he was convicted on all 34 counts of a bogus sham legal trial. I've done Julie Noted episodes if you care to watch or listen about why this was a bogus sham legal trial. But you know, I was really afraid when I saw that verdict, as I'm sure you were, many Americans were. And as we were thinking about the Thinker of the Month series, I really wanted to ask Spencer, what are other times throughout history, in the vast grand history of Western civilization, when something like this has happened? Yes, of course, in many ways, it is unprecedented. But really, is it that unprecedented? I'm sure there are emperors or senators or generals way back in the ancient days of Greece and Rome where some stuff that's very similar to this has happened. And I know we'll be talking about that today, so let's dive in. I'm so happy to welcome Spencer Klavan to the show. If there were a modern day pantheon of great thinkers of Western civilization, I think Spencer would have a bearded bust in that pantheon, alongside people like Victor Davis Hanson, Jim Hankins, Roger Kimball, and my former professor. Shout out to Harvey Mansfield. I was so lucky to study under him when I was at Harvard University. Spencer, to read his never-ending bio, is a features editor of The American Mind. He's also the associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and the host of the fantastic Young Heretics podcast. He's the author of this book. I have it right here on the set, which is one of my favorites. It's called How to Save the West: Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. And I'm going to prove to you all how much I love this book. I know you believe me anyway, but I'm just opening to a random page. You can see underline, stars. It's such a rich, fantastic exploration of the maladies of today and, of course, the solutions. Spencer also has a magnificent Substack. I told you the bio is never ending, with his father, Andrew Klavan, no relation. It's called The New Jerusalem, and it is just unbelievable in its wisdom. They write letters to each other, like love letters or, Petrarch to Cicero letters, except that both of them are alive. It's not one of them writing to a dead person. And this August, Spencer is releasing yet another book, which I have pre-ordered. You can pre-order on Amazon. Here it is. It's called Light of the Mind, Light of the World: How New Science is Illuminating, oh my God, is this going to be good, Ancient Truths About God. And as a final shout out before we dive in, I have to shout out, keeping it all in the family, Spencer's brilliant sister, Faith Moore, who I've been so lucky to welcome on this show. We talked about her great book, Christmas Carol, and Carol is spelled with a K, about why women really shouldn't follow the advice of the feminists and should consider, maybe getting married and having kids and doing what actually makes a good and fulfilling life. Check out that episode where I interview Faith. And then we had another episode where we talked about her fabulous podcast called Storytime for Grown-Ups. Season 1 is Jane Eyre, and Faith profiles a great classic book that everyone should know and makes it understandable because they're hard to read. But I have here just my shanty copy of Jane Eyre because it is one of my favorite books, and Faith and I had a nerd out session about Charlotte Bronte when I welcomed her to the show. But right now, we're going to welcome, finally, Spencer Klavan. Hi, Spencer. Welcome back.
Hi, Julie. It's so good to see you. You're always so generous. I have to fault you, though, for forgetting to include the marble bust of Donald Trump that will surely occupy a prominent position in the Pantheon. Many people are saying, to quote one of the great thinkers, that Donald Trump really belongs.
Oh, he does.
Aurelius. Yeah, no. Glad we're talking about him today.
Yes, he totally does. That's why I say our martyr was martyred back 2 weeks ago in that conviction. But you're right. He definitely deserves one. So, I've been thinking a lot these days about civilization. And I know that's your vocation too, to just all day, every day, just contemplate civilization. And if I kind of look at the broad scope of it, it seems that there was this height during Greece and Rome, 2,000 years ago, roughly. And then there was the fall and dark ages for some time. And then we saw the height again, the resurgence of these ideas with the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation. Spencer, are we right now, in your judgment, on the cusp of another fall? Or is that too dramatic?
It's certainly not too dramatic. I'm always wary about making predictions, both because I personally am very bad at it, but also because in general, I actually think it's an article of faith that we don't know the future. The future is not set in stone. I'm not a determinist. And I think that ultimately these final questions about the fate of humanity belong to God in their purest form. They're questions about the end of the world, the end of civilization as we know it. And one of the things that Jesus says in the Bible is that not the angels in heaven, not the demons in hell, not even the Son of God himself, but only the Father can kind of tell exactly how these things are going to go. So for all of those reasons, and also because I believe that despair is a sin, I never want to pronounce absolutely on the coming end of our civilization. But I will say this: there are a lot of news stories these days that come across my desk, and I file them in what I call the "What did you expect" file. And what I mean by that is that it's not like I welcome or celebrate these signs of civilizational decay. It's just that given some of the patterns that we see throughout history, when you see this stuff go down, you think, what did you expect? And so I might kind of complicate your topography of human history just a little bit by adding in a few more peaks and troughs. I think you're absolutely right that with the Roman Republic and some of the glory days of the Roman Empire, we have a pinnacle of something that begins in Athens and moves throughout Europe via Rome. And that pagan worldview, that pagan civilization kind of exhausts itself. It was beginning already, I think, to exhaust itself when Christianity started to take root. But really, the arrival of the Christian explosion, revelation onto the scene, did ultimately deal the death blow to the pagan world. And then it took some time for the Christian church, as you indicated, to establish its foothold. I think there was another peak in what we call the High Middle Ages. It's typically maligned these days as the Dark Ages, right? That was kind of a PR campaign that was invented after the fact by the purveyors of the Enlightenment. But, you know, it's in the High Middle Ages that we have things like the foundation, the creation of the university, but also the groundwork is laid for modern science in a way that isn't always fully acknowledged. But you're absolutely right that way of looking at the world too did sort of exhaust itself at what we think of now as the dawn of the modern era, the brink of the Renaissance. One of the reasons why there needed to be a Renaissance, which is a word that means rebirth, is because that medieval Christian worldview had also kind of lost its juice, had become exhausted. And I don't think it's too much to say that right now we're in another period of exhaustion. It doesn't mean that we have to go through the same kinds of turmoil that, say, Rome went through at the end of its lifespan. But you do see how that Enlightenment scientific revolution worldview, which gave us so much, which really did revolutionize the world and provide this enormous prosperity, many American traditions that we value emerge, at least in part, from that rationalist way of looking at the world. That is all starting to calcify, to turn into this kind of dead religion in some of the same ways that maybe you might say the medieval Catholic Church became kind of a repressive force. And when you see people out in the streets, like taking a knee for quote unquote racial justice, or demanding submission to quote unquote the science, capital S, you're really looking at a kind of regression. You're looking at people sort of sliding back into these tribalist, pagan, primitive ways of living. And what I think of when I see that is I think we'll certainly due for a revival. We're certainly in need of an infusion of new energy, new life force. And what every revival really is a return to the sources of our ancestral wisdom, but for the modern day. Now, do we first have to go through a cataclysm, a fall, before that happens? My hope is not. My hope is that no period in history looks exactly the way any other period looks. But the bad news is that if our period looks like anything, with these political persecutions, with the decay of Republican values and traditions, with the recession of kind of the rule of law from the public sphere, if that looks like anything, to me it looks like the waning years of the Roman Republic, kind of from 133 BC on through to the establishment of the empire in the 30s. So as I say in my book that you very kindly plugged at the beginning, if there's a period for us to look at for precedent and to think about where we are, unfortunately it might be that one.
You know, Spencer, I'm glad that you, in your words, complicated my topography of Western or of civilization, because
we love complicating topography here. It's just one of our favorite pastimes.
That's right. It was a very TLDR John Green-esque topography. But you're so no, this is so right, and I'm so glad that you cut in, because you are, as I said, one of the busts in the modern pantheon of great, knowledge bearers of Western civilization. So I really do want to zoom into these periods that you uniquely know so well to figure out, okay, when else did we see this? And I think what you're highlighting here is so true, that we need a renaissance again. Weirdly, we need a rebirth of ideas, and that's what you're doing, and why I so love and support. And you say generously, I just say obviously plug your work, because this is what you're doing, and this is what we have to do. We have to remind ourselves of who we are, and as Western civilization. So let's go back to those waning days, as you say, of the Republic. Can you tell us what was going on there that is similar to our moment now?
Absolutely. And there are kind of a number of different parts of this that I think we could stand to pay attention to. The first parallel has to do with populist uprising, which of course is a major feature of the Donald Trump phenomenon. And I might even say is prior to the Donald Trump phenomenon. I'm one of these people that thinks, of course, Trump is a unique figure. Nobody can do it quite like him. But he also rides a wave. If he had come along 100 years ago, he wouldn't be the same kind of phenomenon as he is today, because he's harnessing an energy that was in the air. And that, above all, falls under the category of what did you expect? Because much like now, at the tail end of the Roman Republic, what you had is the capture of Republican institutions by a self-interested elite. This is what Machiavelli, the sort of brilliant observer of antiquity, among other things, Machiavelli says this about the decay of the Roman Republic, that republics don't decline in the same way as other political systems. What happens is they basically harden into oligarchies. And so the reason I mentioned 133 BC as sort of my start point for this whole period of decline is because that's when you get the first instance of civic bloodshed on Roman soil within Rome, since effectively the expulsion of the kings. And Rome had, begun as a monarchy, understood itself as sort of the product of a revolution, much as America does, and was proud that they settled their differences via rule of law. They had, of course, a very warlike culture when it came to their outward-facing endeavors. And for the kind of 2nd century BC, over the course of the 100s BC, they had been expanding those military enterprises. And that is one of the reasons why they started to lose their grip on the rule of law at home, is because partially through circumstance of history and partially through ambition, the Roman state expanded in this huge way into Greece, but also eastward further. And, there were all sorts of territories that fell to Roman power and became, in various ways, client states of Rome. And this meant that there was new land coming in, new wealth that was accessible to, it was supposed to be to Roman citizens. And there were laws that limited how much of that could be gobbled up by any one patrician or any one family. But through various workarounds, the elite in Rome had basically managed to hoover up all of this land. And so more and more you had this dispossessed class of people that effectively should have been what we would think of as a middle class. They were soldiers, many of them veterans who had fought to win this land, but they couldn't get a hold of it themselves. They couldn't get a piece of the pie. And if this isn't starting to sound a little familiar, then I'm not sure why you're watching this show, because presumably your audience is aware of the decline of the middle class, the dispossession of your average American, the sense that even if there is increasing prosperity overall, globally even, there's a whole contingent of people that are supposed to be kind of our guys that aren't getting in on that. And this is what globalism has done for us. It is also what the expansion into the known world did for Rome. And so much as you had a Trump figure for us who came along to mobilize all of this energy, all of this frustration, resentment, even, you also had these brothers, they're called the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, who came along and said, Tiberius made, according to Plutarch, a very moving speech in which he said, the beasts of the field have places to lay their head, but those who fight and die for Rome have no land. And this was a sensation. It was transformative, and it was also ferociously resisted by the landed wealthy interests that opposed Tiberius. And when this conflict came to a head, you had the first instance of civil bloodshed, and Tiberius himself was killed. He was succeeded by his brother, who was far more radical in the constitutional reforms he wanted to drive home. And one of the things I often say to people who are worried about Trump, or who feel that he represents some kind of dictatorial force, is if you're afraid of Trump, just wait for what comes next if you continue to drive him and his supporters out of public life. Because this prosecution, which you have mentioned, and now this conviction, of course, thankfully, isn't an act of physical violence, but represents, I think, some of the same impulses on the part of the reigning uniparty to systematically delegitimize the populist movement, and thereby, of course, throw fuel onto its fire. I mean, if the people in the White House, if the people who want Trump out of public life altogether, if they succeed, the major tragedy that represents will not just be Trump's own persecution, but the kind of energy that it'll introduce into American politics, and the spirit of retribution that will surely arise when you have all of this energy that was expressed democratically in Trump by people who voted for him according to the system, who believed in the system, and who are now being told that their success within the system is ipso facto illegitimate. So I think that's one of the first things to kind of be aware of and be cautious about for anybody that imagines that this kind of lawfare against Trump is without consequences. I worry that if this populist energy can't find an outlet within the legitimate system, it will begin to seek actual animus and antipathy toward the system. That is, it will begin to persecute its interests in all the ways that the Trump derangement people actually fear. We're playing with fire here, I guess, is a short way of saying what I've just said in a roundabout way.
Was it Mark Twain who said, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes?
I believe so, yeah.
That's giving Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes vibes. That is
absolutely, yes.
What you have just said is so staggeringly important. And, I think that because of the advancement of technology, which has been so rapid in our time, we get this idea that when it comes to human nature, things change quickly too. I think that's behind our whole remaking of gender. We think we can remake human nature in the same way that we've remade, or advanced technology. And I think what we as a culture fail to understand is that in the realm of technology, we can and should advance. Well, maybe should is not the right word when we're having AI girlfriends. Maybe actually we should curb technology's advancement a little bit. But in the realm of technology,
your mileage may vary.
Yes, you talk about that in your book, how to save the West. You terrified me when you were talking about all of those technological things, but it's so people need to know about it. In the realm of technology, advancement is one thing, but in the realm of human nature stays the same. Things generally don't tend to change in the realm of human nature. And so that's why this is so interesting, because we actually have been through this before, we Western civilization people. And so I'd like you to continue, please. It's terrifying us, Spencer. Enlighten us. How, so you're right. You're saying we're playing with fire here. And if this populist energy isn't channeled, if you think Donald Trump is so bad right now, just wait for what's coming. What did come in the Roman Republic, in the Roman Empire? What possibly could we be awaiting?
Great question. Well, what came in the immediate term was, as I said, political violence, which was a shock to the Roman system. And in fact, once it began, the historian Appian, who gives us a lot of this material, tells us this was the beginning of the end. Because once you've introduced violence as a principle into politics, which again, I want to be clear, hasn't happened to us yet, except perhaps in the riots of 2020,
right,
which sort of gave us rumblings of what that would look like. But once you begin to decide political disputes on the basis not of deliberation and law, but on the basis of violence, then it's only a matter of time before that unravels altogether. And what you said about human nature is so important and so astute, because this idea, which we call in Greek anacyclosis, that there's a cycle of regimes that repeats. People do think of this as if it were kind of a medicinal prescription, like once you get the democracy, then you're going to get mob rule. But it's much more of a rhyming kind of pattern, as you say, because what it really is a very astute set of observations about the dynamics that tend to play out when you get people in certain situations, in certain relationships of rule. And so one of the things that happens once you start deciding political questions by force or by illegitimate wielding, weaponization of the law and of the system, is that retribution sets in. It's extraordinarily natural to human beings to want to get their own back. And in fact, you're already seeing this on the right with the reaction to Donald Trump's prosecution and his conviction. Whom can we jail now? Whom can we put in jail?
Yes.
And the answer, so the version of this that unfolds in Rome is, what can we get by starting a riot? What can we get by killing our enemies? And this really comes to a head in the civil wars of the 80s and slightly thereafter in Rome. You have these two major figures, Marius and Sulla. And Sulla kind of comes up under Marius, but it's this very tendentious, kind of fractious mentor relationship that ultimately devolves into jealousy and rivalry. Marius was this elder statesman who was very, very jealous and covetous of Sulla's success. Sulla makes a lot of kind of big achievements under Marius, especially in Africa, but also in Germany. And Marius basically begins to resent this young gun that's come in with all of his charisma and some of his, unorthodox energy. And this eventually unfolds into not only a political rivalry, but an actual military rivalry that ends with Sulla marching his armies, having been effectively disenfranchised by Marius and his political supporters, ends with Sulla marching his armies across the Pomerium, which was this ancestral boundary that Romulus was supposed to have plowed out around the core of the city. And it was a religious taboo against bringing weaponry over that boundary. And once you have that so-called kind of proto-Rubicon, right? This is before Julius Caesar, but it's kind of a precursor to the Rubicon moment. Then you really do have some ugly stuff that starts to unfold, including the famous prescriptions that Sulla imposed, which were lists of political enemies to be hunted down and killed. And so when, for instance, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez starts to fantasize about getting Trump supporters on I want a list of all the people, after January 6th, I want a list of everybody that supports Trump. Now, again, is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a new Sulla? No, absolutely not. But once you start toying with these forces, another great quote about history is that it always repeats itself. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. And we've got a little bit of that going
yes.
on too, that some of our figures are so much more ridiculous than these grand names from antiquity. But that's kind of the next stage, is the retribution stage, which begins this cycle that's very, very difficult to get out of. And so I think we need to be very cautious. I understand the impulse to say the Democrats know how to wield lawfare. Now we must learn to wield power in this way too. Understand that impulse. But one of the things you have to remember about retribution is that this is precisely the thing that Christianity is supposed to put an end to, right? If Donald Trump is this weird kind of scapegoat that the left has elevated as a sort of sacrificial lamb, one of the things the gospel teaches us is that once you enter into that cycle, it never, ever, ever ends. And so we have to find a way. Of course, we should prosecute against all crimes, political and otherwise, to the full extent of the law. But if we react to this moment simply with retribution, simply with the impulse to get ours, then we really are falling down exactly the path of Rome. So we've got to find a way out of this that doesn't just involve, you did this, it was illegitimate, therefore I'm going to do this other illegitimate thing back at you.
You know, I think AOC would like to jump on this moment to say what a horrible bigot Spencer Klavan did to insult her, but I don't think she'd get that reference. I just have a feeling she wouldn't know the reference. So we're in the clear. I'm just picturing her wanting to seize on it and go, he compared me to but it was bad. It was bad. No, I love that you brought up, you know, the sort of the reaction right now of the right. And it's an understandable reaction, but, you know, even this morning, Spencer, and I say this because we're live in real time. Hello, by the way, to the chat. There are people who are writing in. Nice to see you. Yo, exactly. You know, this morning there was news that Hunter Biden was convicted. And, you know, I did see a lot of people on the right just immediately jump into cheers for that conviction. And full disclosure, I haven't read it yet because I was prepping for this great interview, but I think that we on the right need to be careful to not just cheer something because it's, you know, the other side getting theirs. Now, from what I know of this Hunter Biden conviction, it is warranted. It is in the scope of the law. But all I'm saying is, you know, we can't play the game that they're playing. We have to be tempered here. And we have to make sure that if we're going to cheer Hunter Biden being convicted, it better be right that we're cheering Hunter Biden being convicted. Because as I often say, and I sense that, and that you're the same way, you know, I don't have allegiance to left, right, liberal, conservative. I have allegiance to one thing, which is God and the truth. And that's what we need to have right now. Allegiance to God and the truth. I do have a question for you, but I see you want to cut in. So cut in.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It can wait.
No, well said. Like, look, if he's guilty, he's guilty, right? And nothing that I'm about to say means that conservatives shouldn't be forceful in their application of the law. That I'm not saying that Joe Biden isn't himself guilty of any number of crimes against the country. But, however, you're absolutely right that there is a difference between what the left wants and what we want, right? I mean, there's supposed to be. We actually have a philosophical difference about how this stuff works. And if that's, you know, I'm sure there are going to be people who hear us talking this way and say these squishes, you know, these rhinos, like
exactly.
Always the way
exactly.
Weak, you know, and wield power the way the left can wield power. Right, exactly, because the left has no principles.
Yep.
What are you, an idiot? Of course we can't wield power in that way, like because we're actually on the side of something else. And if we feel like this is just like too abstract or too airy, we have to remember that, you know, there is a mechanism for punishing high crimes and misdemeanors on the part of the president, and that is called impeachment. And of course that weapon has already been cheapened by its retributional use. Mm-hmm. And of course that creates serious structural problems for us. But remember also why impeachment is there, because if you don't have a political outlet for prosecuting these sorts of things, then of course you do have to jail former politicians, which is not illegal, it's not anti-constitutional, but there's a serious norm against it. And there's a good reason why, which is if you can put your political opponents in jail, after they've been in office. There's no reason why that wouldn't be the standard procedure for all former presidents. This is not only recognizable Banana Republic stuff, it's also arguably the final nail in the Roman Republic's coffin. Because everybody knows Julius Caesar, right? Everybody knows he crossed the Rubicon, which was to say, brought his troops over the boundary that was supposed to, at the Rubicon, you were supposed to basically divest yourself of your military command and hand it back over to the Roman state. And one of the things that was so scary about Sulla before Caesar was that the army was loyal to him and not to Rome. This is something, again, that we might draw some parallels with, like Mark Milley and some of these, woke generals and so forth. But the army's supposed to be at the disposition of the state. That's like a crucial element of the rule of law, because otherwise force is really what's in charge, and whoever can wield force is better. So that was Caesar's like big explosive moment that triggered sort of the end of the Republic. But what we don't always remember is why he did it. And one of the major reasons why he did it is to avoid political persecution, political prosecution, because his enemies were champing at the bit for him to lay down his office as consul so that they could try him for his crimes. And Pompey and the Senate basically forced the issue by saying, you've got to, come into Rome in order to be reelected as consul, which would have given his enemies a window of opportunity to effectively jail him. And they thought he wouldn't, they basically played a game of chicken with him, where they said, you have to do this because the alternative is effectively carrying your soldiers across the Rubicon. And they didn't think he would do that, but he essentially called their bluff and did it. Now, none of this is to say like, yay, Caesar or anything, just to say, again, under the heading of what did you expect, like if you threaten politicians with political, with rather legal persecutions after they hold office, you're going to end up with politicians that are ready to do extreme things in order to avoid that eventuality. So yeah, like, does that handicap us relative to the left? Of course. But if we can't find a solution to that problem, what are we even doing? Why be a conservative or a Republican at all if we don't stand for something other than what the left stands for? And I think that's really the crucial question facing us right now, is how do we find a route through this that isn't simply playing the game in reverse? Because we know how that movie ends.
Absolutely. What I do worry about is that, and you wisely said at the beginning, that you don't get into the realm of predictions, but I do fear at times that we may be too far gone, because there is such institutional capture. Even if Donald Trump wins in 2024 and serves for 4 years and fights the left all over again, here's what I fear. The Department of Justice, as we know, is suing the state of Tennessee over Tennessee's recent statutes. By the way, aren't you in Tennessee? Hi from LA. You're in Tennessee right now. The DOJ is suing your state because they passed a law forbidding gender-altering surgeries and puberty blockers for minors. We are now at this place where the DOJ, our country's Department of Justice, now a truly Orwellian term, is suing a state, saying that constitutes discrimination against trans kids. That's one example. We know, and I was very honored to interview Kyle Seraphin on this show. He was the FBI whistleblower who exposed the internal memo at the FBI, which said that Catholic Americans are, quote, violent extremists. That's another example. You mentioned earlier that who was it? AOC wanted the list of all of the people who voted for Trump. We know that the IRS was going into the bank accounts of, Americans and searching for key terms like Bible, Trump. I mean, there is such staggering institutional capture. So even if we can resist it somehow in the next 4 years, are we just too far gone with this level?
Okay, so my last answer, I'm sure, is going to make everybody think I'm a squish. Now you want
Squish.
radicalism?
Rhino.
Here it comes. You want okay, but okay, now I'm gonna make it the other side angry. So by the end of this, everybody will be annoyed. So that's
good.
Excellent.
That's what we want on this show. We want everybody to be annoyed. No,
exactly.
But we want the truth. We're both we care. We both have allegiance to one thing, which is the truth. So please tell it.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's, are we too far gone? I'm again going to resist answering that question because I just don't know. But I do think solving the problems that you have alluded to is going to look extraordinarily radical. And as much as Trump is made out to be this, like, unimaginable, unprecedented figure who's going to upend all of our norms and systems, I actually don't think Trump is as radical as the Republican politician would have to be that could genuinely solve the problems you're indicating. I mean, I'm talking like gut every administrative body, probably through a shutdown of the government, right? I'm talking about like severe debt reform. I'm talking about like the kinds of immigration reform that like set my hair on end. And all of us are going to have to face up to these really hard solutions to problems that are, to use a buzzword, systemic, structural, and deep set, right? When the conservative politician comes along that is willing to do that, if he does, it's not going to be about getting in the retribution game, but it is going to be about the salting the earth game, right? It's very, very difficult, but also important to make that distinction between, okay, you can do what the left does and play their game if you want and like hit them back as they hit you. But in addition to being kind of like stupid, that's also going to be unproductive. Like that doesn't introduce any new ideas into the system. What we actually need is like a serious reformer who is willing to do the unpopular and difficult, like talk about like entitlement reform, like these sorts of things. And I suspect, Julie, just to deliver some really hard truth, like I suspect that our whole gerontocratic system right now, from Trump all the way to Biden, is really just an elaborate coping mechanism to avoid facing up to what it would actually look like to solve these problems. Because young blood always introduces instability, right? And to actually elect, like, a Ron DeSantis type, let's say, would force us to face like how serious the kinds of solutions to these problems would be. To move away from the classical world for a second into Venice, which famously had effectively a gerontocracy, if not utterly de jure, then de facto and by custom. The Republic of Venice was famous for its stability, which it maintained for centuries, in part by only allowing vecchi, old men, into office. And this is like over 40 because we're talking, ye olden times. But for us, I think we might analogize our situation where it seems like the only people that can get elected are like crypt keepers from Saturday night specials. During the Republic of Venice, there was a traveler who came across an ancient prophecy that when the young rule, the world will either fall apart or advance. And this was in like 1519 or something, just after Luther posted the 95 Theses on the door. And outside of Venice, the average age of the leaders in Europe was something like 33. So the young were already ruling. And this prophecy was obviously an observation about politics. And one of the things that was true is the world was both about to fall apart and about to advance. We talk about a renaissance, you talk about revival. These things are incredibly turbulent and do involve like hardship for everybody. Even if that's hopefully not political violence, it does mean like belt tightening. It means reconsideration on everybody's part of like what it takes to reestablish our Republican way of life. And so I suspect that we're in this position where we're rehashing the same fight between two old men, because we can't bear to contemplate that when the young rule, the world is going to both fall apart and advance. So that's my suspicion. It's not that we're too far gone, so much as that we haven't actually yet faced our real problems. And when we do, it's going to be a bumpy ride.
Totally agree with you. I mean, this is what Vivek was talking about when he was saying we're in a 1776 moment, and a lot of people thought that he was crazy for saying that we need to, reorder the what did he say, abolish the Department of Education and abolish certain things. People thought that he was nuts, and I'm not saying this as an endorsement or a condemnation of Vivek. I'm just saying it as an objective fact that what he was campaigning for, people thought was crazy. But I think, Spencer, you're very wise to highlight this, and you said that some of these changes that need to happen, I think it was when you referenced immigration, do make your hair stand on end. They're nothing that we yearned for. I mean, the idea of deporting, people who come to this country fleeing war-torn, poverty-stricken, realities to seek a better life in the United States, the idea of deporting such individuals is a very sad thing. But as Tom Sowell said, and I often quote, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And we have to do this in order to save the civilization, as dramatic as it sounds, but it's true.
What you're talking about is something that they are now seriously discussing in Europe. I mean, you get the rise, we've just had these EU elections, you get the rise of these right-wing parties. I mean, talk about the what did you expect bucket, right? You see these like viral videos of Germans singing Ausländer raus, right? Like, foreigners get out, Germany for Germans. Like, I don't greet that with any kind of delight. Like, that does not thrill me with excitement to see that kind of thing happening in Europe. But it doesn't surprise me either, because, like, again, what do you expect? You throw your arms wide open. You say, wir schaffen das, we can do this. We take any number of refugees and immigrants from a totally separate kind of culture, and it will mean nothing to us. Like, our local population can just die off while we import, like, just boatload after boatload of people from foreign countries. And you don't have to be a racist or whatever prejudiced like jerk to say that that's simply not a sustainable situation, and it's going to end you up in the desperate situation of having to take drastic action. I mean, in France, they're talking about like deporting people that are basically citizens, like people that have legal right to live there. They're floating these situations. I don't think we're in that position yet, but we are talking about like things that are going to be ugly because we've been put in an ugly position. And I analogize this.
Well
I think this is maybe a provocative analogy, but
go there. I think I love it.
Validity to it. Okay, so like right now there's this terrible war going on in Israel, right? And you've got the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, against Hamas. And Hamas is a terrorist organization that uses human shields. And by that, I don't just mean they like pick innocent people up and place them in line of fire, as terrible as that would be unto itself. But I mean that they embed themselves purposefully within entire communities of civilians, so that in order to attack Hamas, you have to attack these innocent people. Now we've got Israel in a position where it basically must prosecute a war against Hamas because of the atrocities that happened on October 7. And you have all these people saying, look at what Israel is doing. They're killing all of these citizens.
Right.
And of course, the answer to that is no, Hamas is killing the citizens, right? Hamas has placed Israel in this position, has placed its citizenry in this position that leaves the good guys no choice but to do really ugly stuff. I'm not saying that in order to get out of our immigration crisis or our debt crisis or whatever, we're going to have to like execute citizens. That's not at all what I'm saying. But we're in a similar kind of hostage situation where bad governance has so limited our options that the only ones to take that are going to end us up surviving might be extraordinarily unpalatable, and the blame for that doesn't rest with the people who are willing to hold their nose and make those decisions. The blame rests with the people who put us in this position in the first place, which is to say Joe Biden and the entire party that he represents.
Retweet. Retweet at Spencer Klavan. All of what you just said. I really love that quote. I wrote down the timestamp in my notes and I circled it. I need to go back to it. You said, ugly things. Sometimes you have to, we're in an ugly moment, and sometimes that ugly moment demands ugly things. And that doesn't mean that you want to do that. But, you know, running away, if there's one thing that I've really come to see lately, is that running away from the truth, the hard, difficult truth, you only do a disservice to yourself. We got to face the hard, ugly, difficult truth right in its face. And the sooner we do that, the great irony is we could avoid a catastrophe. You know, if we just right now face the truth, we could avoid looking at an even harsher truth. So that's that, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and what if you start from that assumption that we're going to have to face some rocky and ugly choices? If you start from that assumption, chances are that it's going to be better than you are picking. Right? If you begin from the premise that we're in a rough spot, we've been dealt a bad hand, we actually have to make some hard choices, we'll probably be pleasantly surprised. And it's not as if we can't approach this with compassion, with a measure of humanity, right? Of course, all of those things are going to need to be hallmarks of how we address these questions, but they're going to have to be characteristics of what is fundamentally a hard-nosed and truth-oriented approach. If you begin from the premise that the world is an ugly, messy place and we're in an ugly, messy position, then you might be pleasantly surprised that some of this stuff doesn't have to be as ugly as it could otherwise be. If instead you start from this like fantastical pie in the sky idea that you never have to be mean to anybody and everybody can have everything and isn't it great, like then you are going to end up with just like really dire scenarios that look much, much worse than you expected because you began with unrealistic expectations. If you begin with realistic expectations, probably be pleasantly surprised. Like you don't have to go as far in the bad direction as you might fear. That's my hope anyway. And hope, unlike despair, is a virtue.
Boy, I mean, this is a whole other topic unto its own that we'll have to do a Thinker of the Month episode or just another add-on episode about. But how do people survive these days without a biblical worldview? I mean, what you were just talking about is such biblical worldview vibes, if I can speak in modern dialect. No, but seriously, I mean, how I see everything these days through this biblical worldview of good versus evil. That's what we're in a battle right now, good versus evil. You know, I look at the news and I go, what is in line with truth and what is not? You know, all of this goes back to God. And I don't understand how people function without that. Well, I guess I do understand how people function because it's so much of what we're seeing right now. So many of the problems, I believe, in our society is that we've become too secularized. Again, I know I'm opening up a whole avenue of discussion by talking about this, but maybe it's a good thing to end on because I know, Spencer, you do have your new book coming out, which, you know, is just this, right? I mean, can we put up a picture? I'm your PR rep, Spencer.
I know. Listen,
I'm just your de facto PR rep.
Getting a cut. I'm telling you.
Hey, you know what?
We can negotiate a royalties percentage if you want.
Hey, I mean, I'll take it, but if it helps save Western civilization, that's what I'm reaping. That's the benefits that I'm reaping from publicizing. This is it. Light of the mind, light of the world, how new science is illuminating ancient truths about God. Do you want to just, again, I know I really opened this up, but maybe do you want to end on telling us about the book, some reactions you have to what I just said? Anything.
Absolutely.
Really.
This is a good note. This is a good note to close on, and it's something that you and I have discussed both on and off the air now. Is like the role of God, the necessity of faith. You've written about it rather beautifully, if I may say, and I think I can actually answer your question really quickly, and not all too glibly, which is how do people survive these days without a biblical worldview? I think the answer is increasingly becoming with a pagan worldview. They've simply adopted pagan modes of thought and worship. They don't necessarily know that that's what's going on. But one of the things I write about in the book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, is the fact that science was explicitly supposed to be a replacement for paganism. And that's not to say that science is inherently pagan or anything like that, just that in the Christian world, when pagan modes of thought have become illegitimate, you still have to explain some things that paganism used to explain. Like, why is the natural world so wondrous, right? Used to be, well, that's because there are spirits living in it. You can't say that anymore. So instead, you have to say the natural world's a creation of God, and God has imbued his creative power into it. Now it has basically some borrowed creative power that belongs to the true God. And people like Francis Bacon do a lot of writing about how these pagan myths are kind of like allegorical, half understood shadows of the truths that science will now reveal. That's all well and good if you believe in a supernatural God. But if you don't believe in a supernatural God, then you're going to start worshiping the natural world again, this time through science. And science is now becoming kind of reinvested with all of that pagan spirit. And in the book, I refer to this as the birth of the small gods, the idea that atoms basically function the way that pagan gods used to function. They're eternal. They move through the world in these kind of like perfectly predictable ways, and we can perhaps ask them for things, or at least manipulate them to get things. And you want to know why people spent all of the COVID years talking about the science and lighting prayer candles to Dr. Fauci. It's like, this is why. It's because you got to worship something. There's always going to be a sense of the divine in the world. And if it doesn't come from our ancestral scriptures, then it's going to come from the default state of man, which is paganism. John Daniel Davidson has written a whole book about pagan America that talks about this in at great length. And the book, my contribution, I hope, in this book will be to explain how we can have science without becoming pagans, how science and Christianity are not actually at war. What modern science, the latest science, is actually revealing is a thrilling and beautiful new way of understanding the ancient truths of the Bible. But to get that part, you'll have to read the book.
That's a good plug. I like the way you ended that. It's so funny. I know that we are supposed to end, but I do just want to say two things, because I have to get Spencer's real-time reaction or take on them. The first is, you're talking about paganism, Spencer. On a recent episode of Dennis and Julie, Dennis and I had discussed that we're not in a post-biblical age, but to your point, we're in a pre-biblical age. And that's, right. I was just reading that Ireland has this group that's trying to give nature human rights, just like in the Ecuadorian constitution, it grants human rights to a river. We're just substantiating your point and then plug in the book even more. We are in a pagan age, a pre-biblical age. That's the first thing. The second thing, I just have to get your take on it, because I did an episode on this. Speaking of the fact that we're in a pagan age, one of the new trends that I've noticed, especially among people my age, are these tiny little micro tattoos. You've seen them, just sort of like on your wrist, and I actually did a whole episode on Timeless on tattoos and how the history is so cool. I love picking these random things and then doing histories of them. But tattoos became common in the United States because of the Civil War. They would tattoo the name of the soldier on their forearm, and if they were killed in the battlefield, that's how the families, or that's how they would be identified, for the bodies to be sent back to the families. Anyway, I digress. There is a point. Tattoos. I trace the whole history of tattoos, or the whole trends of tattoos, and I've noticed that among people in Gen Z, and I'm 24, we have these like little like moon or star tattoos, and it's very pagan. It's just something I've noticed. They tend to be lightning bolts or sun or and it's just giving pagan vibes. And I'm not saying that in a mean way at all, but it's true.
Right. No, I don't think it has to be mean. I mean,
of course not. Do what you want. They look cool.
Well, and also it's just descriptive, right? This is the natural reflex of humanity.
Yes.
Like, people just tend to interpret their experience of the world as a relationship between themselves and multiple spirits or forces of nature. And there's no reason why that wouldn't continue to happen in the absence of Christianity. C.S. Lewis has this wonderful observation that a post-Christian society differs from a pre-Christian one in the way that a divorcee differs from a virgin. So you begin in pagan world with a perfectly like reasonable and understandable way of relating to the world, which is to describe it as populated by sprites and demons and spirits. And then Christianity comes along and basically unifies that entire worldview into a coherent understanding of things that both gathers together the best of paganism, but also transcends it. And if Christianity then recedes from the world, you don't end up just with your kind of natural, frank, healthy paganism. You end up with this kind of diseased paganism that comes from regression, comes from like a return to sort of the youth of childhood, but in the early, like, you know, it's sort of a second childhood or primitivism. And I think that that's what you're seeing with a lot of these new movements. You know, I have this term that I invented that is kind of obscure, but I think describes all of this stuff. And the term is allegregor. So an egregor is when you create an entity just through communal collective belief, like Santa Claus would be a good example. He has a character, a spirit all his own, but he's created through basically the collective belief in him. An allegregor is when an allegory takes on a life of its own. And now you're seeing people starting to talk about things like nature, Mother Nature. And they think they're being allegorical. But in reality, the allegory is a truer description of what they believe than the so-called literal version. So you'll say, oh, you don't really believe in Mother Nature, and that's no, of course we don't believe in Mother Nature. We believe in like natural forces and and ecology and science and all this material stuff that it's just convenient to describe it as Mother Nature. And then you look at the way they behave and you're like, well, but you think she wants sacrifice. And you make like Apple PR campaigns where Octavia Spencer stars as Mother Nature and she demands sacrifice or she's going to be angry and kill you. And you think like, which of these is a metaphor for which?
Yes.
Like, is Octavia Spencer a metaphor for what you really believe, or is your claim about what you really believe just a smokescreen for your actual belief that there is an entity out there called Mother Nature who deserves human rights? Anyway, these are allegregors, and I think they're basically like everywhere in the world now because we can't function without worship. We can't go back to paganism. We can only do this like weird, diseased, post-Christian form of paganism, which is what we're seeing.
I have the perfect, if I do say so myself, quote to end on, and it's from you.
Great.
In a from a recent post you did, an article called "Eloquent Savages," which is just so apropos. I love that. Eloquent Savages. And Spencer wrote, quote, "Without the solid foundations they were built on, our noble aspirations to liberty and justice start buckling and melting into sick parodies of themselves." It's exactly what you were just saying. I love that term you coined. We'll have to see even more. I'm sure you have more in your book, and it's so fun to have you on the show. Thank you so much, Spencer. Always a pleasure.
A true delight. Thank you for having me, Julia, as always.
And now I'm going to segue into something that your father would love, which is a My Pillow read. So I'm going to bid you adieu and tell everyone about slippers and towels, which I do use. Take care, Spencer. See you soon. All right, everybody, you know, I sleep on a My Pillow. I wouldn't advertise this product if I didn't use it and didn't love it. I wear my slippers, I use my towels, and you can get these products at a massive discount if you use the promo code Hartman or call 1-800-566-6745 today. And in fact, My Pillow is having a huge $25 extravaganza. That's right. It's just what it sounds like. 2-pack multi-use My Pillows, just $25. My Pillow sandals for $25. 6-pack towel sets for $25. Brand new 4-pack dish towels for, you guessed it, just $25. And for the first time ever, the premium My Pillows with all new Giza fabric for just $25. Orders over $75 will receive free shipping. Just go to mypillow.com and use the promo code Hartman, or call 1-800-566-6745 today and use the promo code Hartman. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope that you liked that as much as I did. Spencer is just a giant among men, which is a term I've been using a lot lately on this show, describing Audrey Hepburn, a petite giant among men, and now the same term for Spencer. So thank you. I hope to see you tomorrow at this time, 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern, for live on YouTube. Take care, everyone. I'll see you then.